Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Semifinals overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into the analysis of this. As I'm recording this, Finals is already happening because they all happen back to back to back on all of the days, and so trying to get this out, I am not watching Finals, so I am going to be previewing it at the end of this video because I'm not going to be watching it while recording it. Hopefully this will be out before the end of that series anyways. Really hoping and praying that that ends up being the case, but a very, very fun series with a lot of major stakes. We've got the two British teams going head-to-head with one of their potential Worlds qualifications on the line. So a lot of stakes here, but let me know what you guys thought of this series down in the comment section below. Did you think it was going to go the way that it did? What do you think of these two teams just in general? Who do you want to see win the finals? All of that stuff I'd love to hear more about down in the comment section below. A lot of these players have really grown and unlocked versions of themselves over the course of this split up until this point, and I would love to know which ones you've been most impressed by as well. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. If you're new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in our semifinal series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for every single game in the series, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series. Of course, like I said, I will be previewing the finals at the end of this video. You guys will have seen probably quite a bit, if not all of the finals by the time you watch this video, and so might be a little bit moot, but I'm not watching any of the games in between the takes here, and so you don't got to worry about me being biased. I'm really going to give you my honest thoughts on how that series might end up going, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, today we're only covering one series. It's going to be the semifinals, and it's a very important matchup here between Excel Esports and Fnatic. This is a very important meeting, probably the most important meeting that either of these two teams has had against each other in their organization's history. Obviously, meeting last year in Summer Playoffs was pretty important in that first round. However, that was only important because Fnatic managed to, keep it going and end up getting to Worlds. This time, it really is the difference for Excel between having an opportunity and not having an opportunity. And obviously, making the LEC Finals is a pretty damn big deal in and of itself. So a lot of really important stuff. Excel needing to win this series. If they do not win, they will finish third in the LEC Summer Split, and that will not be enough championship points to qualify them for the season finale because, as I've said in multiple videos in the past, 9 of the 10 LEC teams at some point this year made the top 4. Absolutely ridiculous, but Excel going 10th, this is where it really starts to hurt them, not having enough championship points. But Fnatic on the other side has officially qualified for the season finale. However, if they were to lose this series against Excel, they would drop down into the losers bracket of that season finale, being the 5th seed in terms of championship points. So Fnatic still absolutely has something to play for as well, trying to get into the upper bracket, the top 4 seeds where you really do want to be. And so both of these teams definitely with something to play for. Excel's a little bit more pertinent and a little bit more pressing in terms of significance, but Fnatic still definitely wants to be moving on. And what team doesn't want to make the LEC finals? So very, very interesting matchup. Excel has been better recently, but Fnatic really dominated the regular season, and they looked like a team that was going to be very difficult to beat. They have, I would say, a little bit more immediate talent in terms of what you're looking at, but I think Excel works a little bit better as a team, and their macro in particular in recent weeks has been fantastic. Their mid games have been very difficult to deal with. Even G2, who a lot of people consider to be like definitively the best team in Europe, had trouble being able to keep Excel down in the mid game, and so there are positives for both of these teams. I think if you get a good version of Razork and Humanoid and the players that might be a little bit more feast or famine on the side of Fnatic, they're going to be in a really good spot, but Excel just needs to play their game. They're talented enough to be able to go head-to-head against Fnatic really easily, and like I said earlier, their team play and their macro has been better, and so I think it's going to be a very fun series to watch, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, going game by game, that means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Excel Esports. They are able to take the first game of the series. They're going to move up 1-0, and obviously this is a really big confidence booster. You want to be able to get out in front of this series. You don't want to go down 0-1, have to win 3 of your last 4 games against another good team. You want to put yourself in the driver's seat and prove that you are definitively the better team, at least at the start of this series. And you know what? That's exactly what Excel did. They were definitively the better team at the start of this series, because game one was a little bit of a stomp. And I think that's going to be really good to see for Excel fans. I think that a lot of these players do play a lot off of confidence. Otoamne is definitely someone we've mentioned in the past when it comes to that, but Abbedagga, I think, falls into a very similar trap of, when he's playing well and when, he's clearly confident and things are going right, I think he just plays so far forward and is super willing to make plays on very aggressive picks like the LeBlanc. And then you get games like this, where you get Faker Dogge coming out and absolutely dominating. Pretty easy choice for player of the game. You see a lot of people, especially in the LEC community, talk about LeBlanc as if she's some bad champion that doesn't deal damage, that isn't very good in the meta right now. That is, uniquely a European thing. There is not a single other region in the world that would ever dare say that, specifically the Eastern regions, because of just how oppressive LeBlanc is to play into and how much damage she consistently does. She tops the damage charts in basically every game she's in, even in Europe, where they don't play her quite as efficiently, I would say, but this is the kind of performance that LeBlanc puts out, and this is why I still consider her to be in the top 3 mid laners in the game right now with Jace and Tristana, is because you can have performances like this that are just so difficult to deal with that it really doesn't matter what the enemy team does by the time you hit the mid game. If Abbedagga is going to be aggressive, if he's going to continue to push the pace, it's going to be very difficult to stop him, basically in any capacity. Abbedagga, I've also seen some narratives kind of surrounding him that I don't agree with, which is like, oh, he was really good and then he went to NA and got washed. I completely disagree with that assessment of Abbedagga's career. He was a middling, average mid laner in the LEC, and then he went over to North America and completely unlocked a lot of his confidence, learned how to play with the really aggressive jungler on 100 Thieves, and I think became the best version of himself. And now he's come back over to Europe for Excel, and he's brought a lot of that confidence that he was able to play with in 2021 over to Excel, and I think that's been a major positive for him. So really good to see him playing a lot more like NA Abbedagga rather than LEC Abbedagga from back in the day on Schalke. And so I would say really great game one. Peach was also spectacular on the Sejuani. His pathing is actually absurd. We're getting to the point where I'm, pretty close to calling him the best pathing jungler in the LEC in Europe. He really has been that consistent at being able to beat basically anybody in the early game, be able to generate leads and then translate that into his laners. Reminds me a lot of a budget Kanavi, if you will, like the way Peach plays the game. I do think that's a relatively fair way to describe it. I don't think he dominates in the mid game quite as much as Kanavi does. He's not a carry player in that same vein, or at least Excel doesn't play him like that. But in the early game, the pathing very much reminds me of what we talk about with Kanavi in comparison to a lot of the other LEC junglers. Otoamne was really good on the Gwen, certainly the better top laner in this game. Patrick and Limit were good. We're seeing a rise in play in the Ezreal, and I think that's very interesting. Obviously gives you a lot of safety, but if you're going to go really aggressive topside, if you're going to go Gwen plus LeBlanc with some setup, I can understand wanting something that can be a little bit more, survivable, a little bit less reliant on their support in the early game like the Ezreal. And I think in general, if you're able to play that champion well, you're still able to do quite a bit of damage. And so really good draft and really good execution here from Excel. You're really building around the LeBlanc and Abbedagga, and he paid it out for you for sure. And then for Fnatic on the other side, not a good game number one. You kind of got blown back here. Basically, everybody lost with the exception of Razork, who did have some pressure throughout this game, but it certainly wasn't enough to actually move the needle in any discernible way in favor of Fnatic. A lot of what Razork was able to do was trade back kills after Excel would make a very aggressive play, and while that's a really good thing, it's not necessarily all that relevant. Nautilus was getting picked off at the beginning of team fights, but it would just be a 4 for 0 at that point. It would be, I should say, a 1 for 5, if you will, at that point, and Razork was typically the recipient of a lot of that, but the rest of this team just did not play well, specifically the solo laners, which were major negatives for Fnatic in this game. Oscar Rinnan is a pretty easy choice for dud of the game, just didn't manage the Rumble well, was consistently overheating right before team fights would start, would walk in, not really have any abilities to be able to hit because he's not comfortable on the champion, drop the ultimate, and not really deal any damage. And Rumble's so strong in the meta right now. If you've got a strong Rumble, you're able to take over games. Oscar wasn't perfect yesterday on that Rumble, but he was certainly good enough to be able to completely wreck the game when he was ahead, and that just was not the case here in game number one of this series. That's a little bit concerning. Maybe it's nerves, maybe it was just a bad game. It's going to happen every once in a while, but this was not a good one from him in the top lane. Humanoid got completely out-pressured, and when you're on the Annie, if you're not the one that's moving around the map and trying to create plays and trying to be aggressive, that's a problem, because you're going to get out-tempoed. You're never really going to be able to survive in the 1v1 against LeBlanc. You have to be able to help out the rest of your team, and Humanoid didn't have that advantage. Noah and Trimby were basically useless this game. Noah in particular, I think, did like negative damage in this game on the Varus. I understand the idea behind it, but if you're going to go Annie in the mid lane, I do think you need something that can be a little bit higher consistent damage in the bot lane. I like Varus, especially, you know, in certain comps, but I would have much preferred some sort of hyper carry in this circumstance. An Aphelios, a Jinx, something like that. I know Kai'Sa and Xayah were taken off the board, probably the two most, you know, common AD carries, but Noah's been playing Aphelios all year long, and I do think it fits into this comp a little bit better just in general, and so, you know, just a few concerns with Fnatic. There are definitely worries because they really weren't looking all that clinical in the Heretic series either, and Excel has looked really good, and that has definitely been the case to start the series. It looks like one team is significantly better than the other, but it's only one game. Obviously, Fnatic's got plenty of time to be able to recoup and get back. Are they going to be able to tie the series up at 1 apiece, or is Excel going to take a pretty commanding 2-0 series lead here? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Excel Esports. They are able to take game number 2. They go up in this series 2-0, and they have full control of this series. Both of the first 2 games have been very dominated by Excel, especially in terms of the early game, and man, at this point, it just feels like they are the much better team. Obviously, the series isn't quite over yet. It's a best of 5, and so you gotta win 3, but winning the first 2 is a pretty damn good start for a team that has never really had any sort of playoff success. In fact, they've had trouble even getting here in the first place, not only this year, but over the course of their entire franchise's history. For them to be going into Fnatic in the semifinals and just kind of dominating them in the way that they are right now, it's really wild to see from Excel, and it's certainly not what I expected of this series, even if I did think they were the more complete team in terms of how they played the game. But you gotta give these players a lot of credit. The growth and development that they've gone on over the course of this year to go from 10th to now, you know, potentially, you know, second or at worst third, right? It's a really, really great story. A lot of these players have been on the team the whole year, or at least Odoamne and Patrick have been on the team the whole year. You have a player like Abadaga who's been on roster. Yes, Peach and Limit have been kind of additions throughout the year, but they've done a really good job integrating themselves and creating a new atmosphere surrounding this team that doesn't necessarily reflect the standings and the performances that they had earlier on in the year. So good stuff overall from them. Player of the game, though, in game number 2 is going to go to one of those long-standing members. It's going to go to Odoamne in the top lane. It's a Rumble meta, and you can't really give Odoamne Rumble in a Rumble meta. He's going to dominate you on it. We saw Oscar really struggle on the pick in game number 1. Well, Odo gets it in game number 2, and he proves why it is the best top laner in the game at the current moment. The consistency with which Rumble is going to not only win early, but dominate a lot of these late-game team fights, especially if you've got, you know, consistent lockdown like you did here with the Maokai. It's absurd. We talked about it being potentially called like the Forest Fire duo here with the Rumble and the Maokai. I really like that name. I really like the idea behind it because I really do think it's very difficult to play into these two champions just in general as they work. And Odoamne, I think, piloted obviously at a very high level. When you're getting this kind of performance out of your top lane, it's going to be a ton more difficult to end up losing those games because top lane is just one of those positions where you're typically not actually getting a ridiculous amount of, you know, resources and performance out of them in the current patch. And so when you do have a really good top laner like Odoamne is, you know, he's probably the best player on Excel, that's just such a massive boon. Now, the rest of this team was also good. Peach and Abadaga continue to play really well together and are definitely the better jungle mid duo across this series up until this point, which is a huge turning point pretty traditionally for Fnatic. If their jungle mid's losing, usually the rest of their team is also not playing particularly well, but want to give a massive shout out to the bot lane. We talked about them in game 1 of last week's game, or last week's series against G2 in the winners finals. Really being unlucky for them. You know, pulling out the Kalista and having a 2v2 trade just kind of go the other way, basically for no reason, that I think, you know, 7 or 8 times out of 10, you know, Excel ends up winning that and makes the game a lot more close, but they weren't able to do it, and so it kind of snowballed out of control. Well, you know, the flip side ended up happening here in the semifinals in game number 2, where Patrick and Limit end up just outplaying this gank in the bot lane, this fight in the bot lane, and just look so ridiculously good doing it. It's the mechanical prowess of Patrick that we've kind of been waiting on, and Limit was obviously really good as well. I think I've honestly been underrating him over the past few weeks. I haven't necessarily brought him up quite as much as I think he's deserved. He's been a really big part of this team, but Excel is just clicking. Everybody on this team played well in this game, and they all kind of had superstar moments at different times. Just phenomenal stuff from Excel. And then for Fnatic, honestly, they just feel completely outclassed in this series, and it's concerning for a team that does, you know, want to try and qualify for Worlds. Like, yes, Excel is probably one of the 2 best teams in the league, in the region right now, but for you to not even be, like, close to the same level, it's certainly certainly concerning, especially after, you know, the idea and the fact that you really weren't all that consistent against Heretics. Like, yes, you were consistent at being able to win late game team fights and make sure any game was kind of in your favor, but you lost like almost every early game in that entire series, and that's kind of been the same thing here. There are definitely some concerns. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle this time on the Ivern. That champion is ridiculously strong, especially when you pair it up with the Jason. It just didn't feel like he had any sort of impact. Razork was consistently behind the 8-ball, consistently losing pressure on the map to Excel, and by the time we hit 10 minutes, this game was over because Razork had lost in the jungle so hard, and so really unfortunate game from him. He is a pretty inconsistent, a pretty streaky player, if you will, but I honestly had more faith in him being a consistent positive for this team than someone like Humanoid in the mid lane. And while Humanoid wasn't very good either, Abadaga has definitely been the better mid laner across the first 2 games. It certainly wasn't entirely his fault. Oscar continues to just get completely outplayed in the top lane by Otawamne. This is a completely different matchup than going into Evi in the last series for Oscar. And Noah and Trimby, like I said earlier, just got mega outplayed in the bot lane by Patrick and Limit, who were really on their A game today. It just doesn't feel like Fnatic has enough firepower to be able to keep up in this series, and that's a concern. They're on the brink of elimination here in the summer playoffs. Obviously, they're still going to make the season finale either way, but they don't particularly want to be in the bottom 2 seeds and have to deal with that going into that tournament. They would much rather, I think, get to the final, but their backs are absolutely against the wall. One more loss, one more game, and they're going to be eliminated. They've got to win out from this point. 3 games in a row for Fnatic. And obviously, that's got to start in Game 3. But Excel is 1 win away from going to their first ever LEC final. That's going to be massive for this org if they're able to get it done. And with the way that they've played up until this point in this series, I feel like it's a pretty big, probability that they're going to be able to get that done. But is it going to be in Game 3, or is Fnatic going to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to keep this series alive at the very least for one more game. And they're able to get their first win of the series. And this is a really, really important win, obviously, because if you lose, you're out of the tournament. But even more so, just to prove that you can beat Excel, just to get it in your mind that it is definitely possible. Even if Excel did not play up to their standard in this game, making a lot of mistakes, there are going to be some individual performances that people point out. And while I am going to criticize Excel for them, I also do think that the narrative kind of surrounding a lot of these mistakes is just, like, ridiculous. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But for Fnatic, really, really nice win here. Again, really needed, but going back to some basics, getting Noah on something he can hyper carry on in the late game like the Zeri, I think is a much better idea than trying to take him off of the things that have really gotten him to the point that he's at. He's not really an early game ADC. He doesn't really take a lot of big risks in the early game. There was a reason he had a really good KDA throughout the year, and it's because he really wasn't the guy that they wanted to play to in the early parts of the game. They wanted to play through Razork and Humanoid early on and then get Noah into a position where he can team fight behind a lot of the meatballs and a lot of the setup in the back half of the game. And that was a really good strategy for Fnatic, and I do think it worked a lot better in this game. And then obviously, we got to shout out my player of the game. It's going to go to Trimby in the support position. This rel was mega important towards what Fnatic wanted to do basically the entirety of this game. Whether that was a lot of the mid-game skirmishes around objectives to try and start snowballing the game out of control, mostly on the top side of the Rift Herald, but or alternatively, in the late game team fights where he was finding important targets over and over again and consistently locking them down so that Excel had a much harder time of actually being able to team fight. You can give a lot of credit to Trimby. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are going to blame some of the players on Excel for getting caught by it, and we'll get into that in a second, but Trimby was really good, and if he wasn't playing as well as he did in this game, Fnatic probably wouldn't have won, and so the rel was very important. The Zeri was dealing damage. Big credit to Razork. He's had a really rough series up until this point going into Peach, but the Kindred game was much better. I like him on these more carry-oriented junglers in this particular matchup. It's something that Peach really hasn't brought out at all over the course of this year. It's not really something that they've prioritized, and so to put Razork on something that can be a little bit more aggressive, that can try to skirmish with Peach, which isn't necessarily the way that Excel wants to play the game, I think that's overall going to be a positive idea for Fnatic, and Razork executed on it well. Oscar in him was fine on the orange, just needed to be a little bit more stable than he had been in the previous games, and while Humanoid still made some errors on the Annie and was definitely not necessarily perfect in this game, and certainly hasn't been perfect in this series, he was good enough for them to be able to win with. There were a lot of positives to take away from Fnatic. Although, I think you can talk about Excel a little bit more, and the conversation just generally surrounding Excel in this game is almost entirely centered around Patrick in the bot lane and how he had a really bad game, and I'm not going to disagree with that. I think especially towards the back half, Patrick really needed to be a little bit more aggressive at trying to dodge the rel engages, or at the very least expending resources to make it not nearly as easy on Trimby to get onto that Tristana and make the team fight a lot more difficult. Because Patrick going down super early in a lot of these team fights was a major problem for the team. However, I do want to say, first of all, it wasn't just Patrick that was underperforming in a lot of the big moments in these team fights. I think the entire team really struggled. Odoamne really did not team fight well on the Rumble. Abadaga was really not playing as aggressive as he needed to, and Peach just in general had a pretty bad game on the Sejuani, but there's this narrative, especially on social media, that this is why. Games like this are why Patrick could never be considered a top 80 carry in the LEC. He never performs in the big moments. He can't play well in a playoff series. He always is going to choke. I get it. He had that moment last year that people are always going to talk about where he made the call to end, he ignored the call from his team, and they ended up losing the game because of it. I understand that that's probably the prevailing thought that a lot of people have when it comes to Patrick, but ignoring everything that he's done in the playoffs already in this split is absurd. He went toe-to-toe with Hansama and honestly was just as good as him as throughout the entire series. Hans was great on the Kog'Maw, but Patrick was also really good, and with a couple of things going his way, potentially on some early game champions, that could have been a very different series for Excel. Patrick absolutely showed up against the best team in the LEC, and then I just talked about it in game 2. He had one of the biggest outplays that I've seen all playoffs long, probably the single biggest outplay all playoffs long in the LEC. In that game number 2 on the Callista, and you're going to sit here and say that he's not performing in the playoffs. I don't get it. I don't understand. It's cherry-picking moments, and it's crafting a narrative that isn't based on, you know, the overall prevailing way that he plays the game. Yes, he's going to have some moments where he's caught out and not necessarily in perfect positions, but to pretend like that hasn't happened to almost every AD carry that you say is one of the best in the LEC is absurd. Crownie has done it 100 billion times. Even Hansama has done it a lot over the course of this year. We've seen every AD carry in the LEC really struggle with consistency at staying alive in a lot of these late game team fights. We didn't really get on VTO yesterday for doing it on Kai'Sa. We haven't gotten on Humanoid for doing it all season long on basically every champion that he's done. And so for Patrick, I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack in the grand scheme of things. Yes, I am going to note that he wasn't particularly good at the end of this game, and I think if things had gone a little different, Excel might have been in a better position here. But to make blanket overarching statements because of 1 or 2 plays in game number 3 of a semifinals that they've been dominating, it's just an absurd thing to say, and it's a narrative. Again, it's narrative over actual reality, and I think that is, you know, kind of what I want to push back on here. But the rest of the team, like I said, was also not good. Peach got destroyed in this game, completely lost pressure early on into an aggressive jungler in the Kindred, and never really was able to pick it up. Odoamne team fought pretty poorly. Abadaga wasn't nearly as aggressive, like I said, in this game. I think Excel just lost a lot of things after losing a lot of tempo in the early game, but it was a nice win for Fnatic. Their job's not done, though. You know, for as much of a positive win this is, they've now got to do it 2 more times in a row, or else, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's nice to see that they can win, and they have found a formula that I think can work for them, but I would not expect Excel to make these same kinds of mistakes twice. And so moving into game 4, it's going to be just as difficult, if not more so, for Fnatic now that Excel has a better read. And so are they going to be able to push us to a Silver Scrapes game 5 with all that momentum, or is Excel going to say game 3 was a little bit of an outlier, we underperformed, but we're going to be able to get back on track and we're going to be able to close it out? Well, we'll find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was Excel Esports. They are able to take the 4th and final game in this series to end up 3-1 and to put themselves not only in the season finale, but in the 2023 Summer Split LEC Finals. That is a major accomplishment for an org that looked completely doomed for most of this year. There have been so many things that have gone wrong with Excel, whether that be, you know, player transfers in previous years, or trying to build a super team this offseason and having it just not work out, having to move on from a lot of those players, and finally getting it right with this select few. It's been a massive upgrade for them, and honestly, I'm very excited for these players. You've got to be excited for players like Odo and Patrick that have been around for the entire year, that have seen the lows Specifically, someone like Patrick, who has seen every iteration of this Excel esports team. He's basically existed on this team as long as they have. In fact, I think he has been on every single version of this Excel esports team, which is just wild to say, but here he is in the finals with them. You've got to be incredibly excited for them, but this was just a great series overall. They were definitely the better team. They underperformed quite a bit in game number 3, but they got their shit together in game 4 for a really fun, kind of, chaotic game, and this is kind of what we were looking for between these two teams. Player of the game, though, and player of the series at the same time here is going to go to Odoamne in the top lane. Awesome stuff from him throughout this entire series. I still think he's the best player on Excel. I think the solo laners in particular definitely stepped it up in this series. We'll talk about Abadaga in a second because I think he was the other player that you definitely have to mention. But Odoamne is just the guy for Excel. He wins so consistently early on, and he is the best team fighter in the top lane position in the LEC. Full stop. He's just been so good for this team. I was very hesitant to give up on Odoamne, even when he was struggling, most specifically in the spring split, where he really started to taper off. I was really hesitant to say that he wasn't a top-tier LEC top laner because we know what Odoamne has been over the past few years. He's so consistently been great for basically every team that he's played for, and just because it wasn't working out on Excel, I didn't necessarily want to blame him as the player for it, and clearly that was the case. As soon as he got talent around him that could, just survive a little bit, it gave him the opportunity to flex and flash what he was always really good at, which is basically winning at every stage of the game. While he's not the most dominant laner in the world, he certainly is the most dominant team fighter, so really great stuff from Odoamne. Like I said, Abadaga was also really good in this game and in this series as a whole. The Azir was great, but that game 1 in particular was awesome coming out from him, and hopefully he's going to continue to be as massive of a positive for this team as he has been up until this point. I did not see the Abadaga re-breakout coming in for Excel. I thought that, he was just going to be a good player. He certainly struggled when he was put in at the end of spring and did not have a very good week 1 here in summer, but ever since then, it's basically been smooth sailing for him as a player. It feels like him and Peach are absolutely on the same page, who, yes, Peach had a very good series again with the exception of game number 3, just not being very good for them. Patrick and Limit were definitely the better bot lane in this series, certainly more aggressive in lane and consistently being able to generate those leads early by picking things that they know they can win on, giving themselves an opportunity to be the better bot lane, and they were. Excel just kind of won here. They were the better team, and they're going to be moving on to finals and the season finale because of it, but for Fnatic, your summer split at the very least is done here. You are not going to be moving on to finals. You're going to finish in 3rd place, which is still pretty darn good, considering this team went 9th, 8th over the course of the beginning part of the year. Yes, Excel maybe has got a little bit of a better story, if you will, in the long run, but it's not like Fnatic hasn't completely defied the odds to get here as well. They're also going to be making their way to the season finale, but unfortunately, they just kind of got completely outclassed in this series. A couple players just didn't really show up. Dud of the game here in game number 4 is going to go to Humanoid, and Humanoid had a really bad series. I think it's almost underrated how not good of a series he had. A lot of people talking about Patrick not necessarily avoiding a lot of Rel engages at the back half of game 3. I don't see anybody saying the same thing for Humanoid consistently getting caught out by Rel in game number 4. Yes, the situation was a little bit different, but this was not a good game from Humanoid. I think Oscar was really the only player that was trying to win. I think Razork had a couple of good engages here, but generally speaking, he also lost a lot of pressure early, and I think the bot lane was a major disappointment this entire series for Fnatic. Noah just did not have a good series. Patrick was way better and way more aggressive throughout this entire series, which is not what you would expect from Patrick, who has pretty traditionally been kind of a more passive, more, scale up into the team fight stage of the game kind of AD carry. Noah, somebody who definitely falls into that trend and trap as well, but Noah did not have a very explosive series, and I think that was a bit of a problem. Trimby was good in game 3, but was pretty bad outside of that. Fnatic honestly just felt, like I said, outclassed. They felt like the worst team across this entire series, and that's not really what you wanted to see from a team that had looked so good in the regular season and had gotten 3rd place in this split. I think it's concerning moving into the season finale, but because they weren't able to pick up the win here, because they're not making finals, they are going to be in that lower bracket alongside SK Gaming, and so definitely need to get into form quickly because your extra lives have all been burned this season up until this point. If Humanoid and Noah aren't playing at the level that they need to be playing at in order for this team to sneak into a world spot, then I don't think Fnatic is ever really going to have a major chance. Now, all that being said, Fnatic is pretty notorious for being able to sneak into some of those final world spots, basically no matter what has happened in the season up until that point, and so I'm never going to count this organization and this group of players out just because of how talented they are. But it's certainly not a great look to see them get absolutely decimated by Excel in this series, and it's going to be interesting to see if they're a team that ends up qualifying for one of those top 4 spots. But for Excel, they're now moving on to the finals. They're going to be facing G2. I'll preview that in just a second, because again, I know the series is going on at the moment as I'm recording this, but I have not watched any of the games. I wanted to get this video out, so congratulations to Excel, and I'm really excited to see what they're going to be able to do moving forward. They've earned this. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Summer Split Semifinals Overview and Analysis video. We now know our 2 finalists, G2 Esports and Excel. If you go back and watch my preseason predictions at the beginning of winter, these were the 2 teams that I thought were going to be meeting in finals. It was a little bit more of a bumpy road to get there than maybe what I anticipated at the beginning of the year, but interesting to see both of these organizations end up making it. It was a really interesting series overall, and we'll go ahead and preview it now. I really don't know what's going to happen. Their first series, obviously, in Winners Finals was very intriguing. You know, going to 5 games, Excel fighting back a lot more than people give them credit for, but it's just so hard to believe that G2 is going to drop a series really at any point. They so clearly look like the best team in the LEC. I think Excel is really the only team that's been able to even really touch them over the course of this split up until this point, and so, you know, if Excel keeps things interesting, I'm certainly not going to be surprised, but I would be surprised if Excel was able to take this series. I don't think that Champions is quite in their blood and in their resume. Now, if Odo's the best player in the series, and if Abadaga really steps up going into caps, maybe there's a universe, right? Because, you know, I think Patrick's going to be fine. I think Peach is a super stable player, and I could see circumstances in which if their best players win, things could go really right for them. I just find it very difficult to believe that that is definitely going to be happening for this Excel team. So I am going to predict G2 to be able to take this series, but we'd love to know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. Of course, by this time, you've probably already seen the LEC Finals, so, you know, let me know down below what you guys thought of that as well. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content and helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and with playoffs basically started in all of them except for the LCK, it's a good time to be a League of Legends fan if you want some comprehensive overviews of basically all the teams that might have a shot of qualifying for the World Championship, so you can know what those teams' playstyles and forms are moving into that stage of the year. This is the place for that. Go ahead and hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.